Hi guys, welcome to week 2. We're going to do a couple of lectures this week to talk about the situation of each of the groups that are about to collide during the Age of Exploration. Our first discussion revolves around the Native Americans that are in the Americas at the point of arrival when the Europeans get there. So we're looking at the pre-contact conditions in the Americas. I've got a couple of essential questions for you here. I want you to consider as we're going through this presentation, through this lecture, you should learn by the end how and when did Paleo-Indians come to exist in the Americas. And Paleo-Indians is the name that we give the Native Americans who were original here before the Europeans came. And then prior to European contact, how did the natives of North America live? This is going to be really important because we'll start to compare their belief systems, their lifestyles to that of Europeans and see what that combination will come to when colonies start to appear in the Americas. Alright, so we're going to start off with a little tiny bit of history basics here. And I want you to consider a question. I've got a challenge question for you, okay? What evidence do historians use to study people before written records were left behind? I want to give you a quick minute to think about it, and if you want to pause the video if you're taking notes and actually jot down an answer, that would be great. Okay, so that should be enough time to pause. If you've paused and come back, welcome back. Let's take a look at some ideas. Here's what I was thinking. We use archaeological evidence. It could be bones and the clothing that are on the bones or with the bones. It could be, in some cases, we can actually see what food contents were left behind in their stomachs. So there's a lot of information that we can get from bodies that have been buried. And then also any artifacts or tools, implements, pottery that they made will tell us a lot about their lifestyles. The other thing that's really important to us in study of people before written record are oral traditions, and the Native Americans are no exception. Native Americans have a rich history of oral traditions, and these are the stories that are passed down from one generation to another. Okay, so here's kind of a typical image of a Native American family, and you can tell the older gentleman is telling stories to the rest of the family. So let's talk about Paleo-Indian origins. This time period is approximately from 13,000 to 2500 BCE, and I'll show you a timeline here in a second that puts that into context. Now the details of how people got to the Americas are disputed. I want to start with Native American oral traditions. You notice there are a couple of pictures here, and there are a few different stories about how Native Americans believed through their oral traditions they arrived in the Americas. They believe that they actually originated in the Western Hemisphere, contrary to what we'll see scientifically here in a second. The Iroquois told the story that a pregnant woman fell from the sky, and she came from the sky world with the seeds from the tree of life, and you see that over here on the left side. Here's the tree of life. She's pregnant. She asks her husband to make her some tea from the roots. As he does so, a hole kind of is created there by the base, and the pregnant woman falls through. The Pueblos and Navajos believed that their forefathers experienced dangerous journeys in other worlds, similar to the sky world, before they emerged in their homeland in the Americas from underground. Both sets of stories discuss that the humans could not settle in the Americas because it was all covered in water, but that there were different animals and things like that that helped bring soil, especially you see birds in both pictures and turtles. They helped bring soil up to the surface to form land so that the humans could actually inhabit it. But they very strongly believe that they originated in the Western Hemisphere. Now, from a scientific perspective, let me show you this timeline. they believe that humans arrived at some point during the last ice age to the Americas. And that's sometime between 33,000 BCE and 10,700 BCE, or about 40 to 14,000 years ago, okay? In general, scientists agree that the first Paleo-Indians had arrived in the Americas by 13,000 BCE. Let me give you some context about, because we're throwing a lot of big, weird dates around. Let me give you some context about what time scale we're looking at. Columbus won't arrive in the Americas for another 10,000 years after this date. 10,000 years, that's a long time. Writing is not actually invented until 3500 BCE, and it's invented in ancient Iraq. Ancient Egypt doesn't arrive with the pyramids and everything until 3150 BCE. And Stonehenge is not even completed until 2200 BCE. So we're talking way before ancient times. This is really, really ultra ancient, okay? So scientists believe in general, let me get a pointer here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. They believe that there were two possible modes of arrival. The first is the land bridge across the Bering Strait. So they believe that during the last ice age, temperatures were low enough that the ocean actually froze to the point that a land bridge formed made of ice. And so people from Asia were able to migrate over this land bridge into the Americas. So it also helped that as the water froze, the ocean level dropped. Okay, and so we have quite a bit of glacier activity going on here. So let me flip back to an arrow here. The other theory is that people actually arrived via the coastline. You see my arrow kind of going this way, through boats, primitive boats. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they found some archaeological evidence of some ancient boats in this general vicinity. What we know is that many migrated further southward towards Chile and things like that. There is evidence that there were inhabitants in Chile as early as 12,000 BCE. And here's some more information where we found some archaeological evidence. There's evidence in Oregon where they found fossilized human feces that date to more than 14,000 years ago, or that 13,000 BCE mark. And it was clear that people had reached the Americas at that point in time. There are also some evidence of them being in Clovis, New Mexico, and Chile. They have campsite remains down there at the very southern tip here. So that's kind of where some of the dates are coming from. Now again, I want to put some of this into context. The fossil evidence in the Americas is relatively new. By contrast, you're actually looking at some fossil evidence from Africa, and this fossil evidence ranges somewhere between 190,000 to 160,000 years ago. And this is kind of where the cradle of humanity is believed to have been. So the beginnings of humanity, that's how old that is. By contrast, are you ready? Here is what they call a coprolite, which is fossilized human feces. And these were found in North America, and they're only about 14,000 years old. So 190,000 years old versus 14,000 years old. That's a big difference. Anyhow, around about 8,000 BCE, we see evidence of warming trends. So temperatures rise, glaciers start to melt, sea levels rise, and we see waterways starting to come through the Americas. The environment is a little more familiar than what we're used to. And let me go backwards really quickly to tell you kind of how much of a big deal this was. Let's look at the map. You'll notice on this particular map, the white part is these glaciers that formed. Okay. The Rocky Mountains are here. You'll notice there's some white glacier activity in these areas, but glaciers actually covered a predominant portion of what is now America during the last ice age. So when the warming trend starts to begin, these glaciers recede north towards the North Pole. So they start to melt out, and that's where a lot of the canyons and things in places like California and Yosemite, they were actually formed by these glaciers. Okay, so let's go back. We've talked about warming trends, and we see that Paleo Indians begin to migrate further southward following food. And along the way, various groups kind of stop and settle. The further we go, farming begins to take root, and it spreads as people migrate and trade goods. They share information about how to farm. So let's fast forward a little bit to 1500 CE. So this is approximately real close to 1492. Okay, we want to talk about what was the state of Native American life right before Columbus gets here. So let me give you some facts and figures. There were about 75 million people in the Americas before Columbus arrived. 7 to 10 million lived in North America. So in this general vicinity here, 7 to 10 million, okay? And actually it's probably more like this. 65 to 68 million lived in Meso and South America. So we've got South America here and Mesoamerica here. So Columbus will actually come across the Atlantic Ocean, arrive here in the Caribbean area. Eventually, the Spanish explorers will continue on into Mexico and South America. And that's where they'll spend a lot of their time, whereas we'll see the British and French colonies will start to set up camp around in this general area. Let's talk a little bit about how the Native Americans lived, because I want to compare that to life in Europe and life in Africa. Most tribes lived in extended families, so they were large groups that were connected by family members. It's long bloodlines. The extended families of the women actually took precedence over the men. And this is largely because in many cases a lot of the women did the farming and cultivation, especially on the east side of the Americas. This control over farming actually gave women quite a bit of power within their communities. Spiritually, and you've got a nice picture here, they believed that their natural world was alive, well connected, and that it consisted of a variety of spiritual forces. So they believed that the trees had spirits and the animals had spirits, and they were very observant of that. Their behaviors in this world were driven by these spiritual beliefs, which is in great contrast to what we'll see in Europe. The main thing that I want you to consider is how they behaved economically, if you could call it that. They operated on the principle of reciprocity, and the idea behind the principle of reciprocity is very similar to trade. So let's say I have, as in this picture, a fish, and you've got some grain. We might trade evenly. We'll do an even swap. There is not a concern that one group gains over another one. So we're not looking for profit or to be better than the other. There was a lot of trading of gifts and favors, but this is common in what's called a non-market society, so something that's not like capitalism at all. This is really, really critical. I do want to talk about how isolated the natives were. They have very limited scientific knowledge by comparison with the Europeans prior to the Age of Contact. They didn't have a lot of innovations for travel, so even if they travel, they're not going to get very far. You see this picture here? This is much, much later. We don't have domesticated animals. There are no horses. They actually get those from the Europeans. So basically, what I want you to think about is that the Native Americans were largely isolated for thousands of years before the Europeans began to approach the Americas. This is critical. So this is the end of this particular lecture, and I want you to do a little bit of thinking that will bleed into your assignment. Based on what you know now about the lifestyle and their relative isolation in the Americas for the Native Americans prior to Columbus getting there, how do you think the Native Americans will differ from the Europeans and the Africans of the same time period? And what do you think the consequences of those differences will be? If you're taking notes, now is a great time to jot that down. This is definitely something you need to consider before you complete the assignment. I think we're going to have 1 or 2 more lectures for this week. So once you finish up with this one, jot down some ideas and you might start up with the next one. I'll see you guys soon.